Oftentimes, when it comes to art, we tend to function under the belief that we have more control over our art than we really do, despite having experiences that suggest the contrary. If you've ever spent hours tweaking, erasing, or adjusting your drawing with the goal of making the image appear exactly how you'd wish, you might have already realized that it's actually quite difficult to force your art to look the way you want it to. But it's difficult for reasons not often discussed. And the act of trying to force this control over the art is something I find damaging to the practice. To me, insisting that your art bends to your will is, to put it lightly, extremely out of touch with your relationship with art and dismissive of the personal connection and introspection required to make art you care about. I talk a lot about rigidity and resistance in the practice and why it's important not to force anything, but I think it's important to go into why this is the case. There's a way to look at your art practice that you've likely never considered before, and it's the fact that your art can communicate with you, suggest things to you, and that it has a mind of its own. There are a lot of ideas about control, authorship, and the self in the art practice that I need to dismantle in order to get to the core of this concept, and I'll need you to go there with me. As you spend time with your art, you might have occasionally experienced a particular barrage of discomforting feelings that arise when what you're making isn't quite working out the way you had hoped. In this state, it's likely that you would then feel compelled to force things in a picture to happen the way you want, but you quickly realize that it's of no use, and it's as if your creation is falling apart and crumbling in your hands as you attempt to salvage it. This urge to correct stems from the idea that you are the only one in control of this whole art-making process when you are in fact not. You may ask, well, how could it be that I, the one doing, the one moving my hand and making the marks, how am I anything but the only one in control? I implore you to experiment and prove the notion that you are the only one in control of this act. Try to guide everything in the process from blank page to finished artwork. Control each stroke of the pen and each muscle and tendon in your hand as they adjust the weight of the pen to make the perfectly intended stroke. If you were truly in control, the first sketch would come out exactly how you could have hoped it to, right? Actually, would you even need a sketch? You would probably nail every component of the picture to the best of your abilities on the first attempt. Each face, hand, pose, and foreshortened limb you draw will come out perfectly aligned with how you envisioned it. You won't have any pesky thoughts of, why is it turning out like that? Or, I can't seem to get this part to look how I want it. The truth is, your reactions to things not going how you want are already evidence that you are not the only one in control of the art making. Responding to unintended outcomes with these sorts of feelings shows that you're interfacing with the thoughts and actions of another mind, and that there are numerous aspects of the process that the you who claims to be the one doing the work is simply not in control of. This conscious part of you probably isn't even aware of everything that it's not in control of, things that nonetheless still make significant contributions to the art. Under the belief that you are the only one in control, actually attempting to control everything, like in this experiment I just detailed, also shows that you didn't even know what everything should be in the first place. And by everything, I mean each component that would compose the finished product. The common experience is that as we work through a vague idea, more things reveal themselves to us that we did not initially plan for, and that it's an incredibly difficult, if not impossible, pursuit to be able to capture all of what we imagine, or to even imagine in the first place. And from this, if you've only ever given this a few seconds of thought, we tend to come to the conclusion that this impossibility is due to our lack of skills or experience in our creative or imaginative abilities. But I would say I don't think so. I don't think that's mostly the case. To me, a lot of these thoughts can be traced back to a lack of communication with our art. Why do we sketch, plan, and ideate or do thumbnails? I think that as most people view it, we do these things in preparation for something larger we may want to do. But I still see this as another example of our lack of authority over it all. Through this preparation, Ideas emerge because the nature of these activities require you to be engaged in conversation with the art. If you were in control, you wouldn't need to hunt for ideas or pre-plan a piece or a project. Yet, we continue to return to art and ask it for its guidance. This is an area of the practice whose existence only makes sense from the viewpoint that we cannot control what happens or how it happens, and that it's up to these internal discussions we have with the art to make discoveries and come to conclusions about different areas of the practice. So, in a way, this is somewhere you might have already been engaged in this conversation without even knowing it. But now I want you to be aware of it. I want you to key into these thoughts and look at them through the lens of communication and not just random negative feelings. I think that recognizing that the art has a mind of its own isn't just a way to look at my art, in air quotes. It's more of an acknowledgement of the truth. The process of learning this requires knowing what qualities make up a mind, the nature of communication, what happens when two minds intersect and have opposing wills, and developing an awareness of these qualities as they present themselves in the art as feedback, signals, and impulses. This feedback that your art can give you comes in many forms, but one of the most noticeable ways it communicates with you is through the feeling of resistance. I find resistance in particular to be an interesting mode of communication that art utilizes, and an especially important one for us to pay attention to. There are a lot of things that art tries to tell us through resistance that tend to fall on our own deaf ears. Many times, the feeling of resistance is your art's attempt to nudge you and give you a heads up that what you intend to happen isn't what it thinks should happen in the process. And although you might feel that your art should look exactly how you want, the truth is that your art won't cater to your feelings, but it will notice when your feelings are distracting from the process and will warn you accordingly. In many ways, I believe the art is wiser than us, so it's likely in our best interests to listen to what it's trying to get across to us. But aside from resistance, there are also other impulses we feel while working that are cues from the art, such as fear and worry, joy and excitement, and anger or disappointment. All of these are ways that the art may choose to speak to us, but I'll refrain from inflecting my own interpretations on these messages from the art and leave these to you to use your thoughtfulness and creativity to decipher what these impulses mean for you and how you should respond to them as it concerns your practice. But don't ignore them. Art will likely continue to repeat these things to you until you finally listen to it. You need to work with your art by listening to these impulses and not forcing your will upon it so harshly. This way, you and your art can discover together what you will both agree upon, which might even result in a different outcome from what you originally intended to create. I believe some of the best work comes from being in tune with what your art wants, or, in other words, having a sensitivity to the subtle nudges and impulses you feel while you create, and foregoing those that aren't in service of the art. I believe that many negative emotions, although important messages from the art, aren't at all necessary in the practice in the grand scheme of things. For a certain amount of time, it's important to grapple with them and understand them and learn from them, but ultimately, it may be beneficial to weed them out one by one as you come to terms with the nature of art, as you get to know it better, and only have positive impulses be the agreed method of communication between you and your art. The art practice is not just a one-sided engagement. It's an ongoing relationship that requires loving attention and careful listening from both parties. And you can't have a healthy, meaningful relationship without listening and communication. You can listen to your art by recognizing its cues to communicate with you, but you might wonder how it can listen to you. There's a way I found to recognize when your art is listening to you. It's the subtle feeling of congruency that appears when you feel like you're hitting upon something while you're working, when you're sharing your ideas with your art, and something you suggest to it seems right or it just works. Sort of like you tried an idea and it actually feels viable. This is you communicating your idea with your art, and the art listening and agreeing to try it out. The same thing happens the other way around, as in your art presents you an idea that you decide to go with. Have you ever been drawing or painting and something you didn't intentionally do sort of stood out as an interesting direction to go with a piece or an idea? Maybe a stray mark of the brush or a messy spot of an unfinished area leads itself to being something that you just lean into or explore further. We often view these instances as mere chances or happy accidents that just came about that we didn't even intend for. And if you've ever completed a piece that was largely built upon these seemingly happenstance occurrences, you might find it difficult to explain to others why you made each decision you did. But really, you were engaged in an internal conversation between you and your artwork that resulted in the chain of decisions that led to the completion of the piece. And it deserves mentioning that art doesn't just communicate on a piece-by-piece basis either. Pay attention to what you feel if you tend to cave to trends and draw what's popular because you think you should, or how you feel when you're focusing your efforts towards learning something others told you you should know, or drawing the way people say is more acceptable. Notice your feelings when improvement and getting good take precedence over the art itself. Do you feel joy and fulfillment in these pursuits? Or do you feel this lingering sense of anxiety, boredom, dissatisfaction, or inadequacy while you work? Do you notice a sort of disconnect or lack of sincerity between you and the art that's a bit difficult to put into words? This is still the art speaking to you, and not the art in the form of a single piece that you're working on in the present, but art in the form of your approach to the process at large. Whether you feel any of these things, positive or negative, there is still valuable information here. These are opportunities for you to listen to what the art is saying to you. The first step in connecting more deeply with your art is understanding that the art has a mind of its own, but this is only the surface of this concept, and there are several levels of thinking deeper than this that could be achieved, such as the idea that you and your art are one and of the same mind, in communion with one another, yet in recognizing its sentient nature. You may come to find out that we are all subordinate to it, and its depth goes far beyond our comprehension. As hinted at before, our art is in many ways wiser than we are, as we can only contemplate and rationalize our decisions on a conscious level. But arriving at a finished piece of art necessitates the engagement of several faculties beyond your conscious control. Apparently, there is a fair amount of research that suggests that only 5% of your brain's cognitive abilities are on the conscious level. 5% is just the tip of the ever-expansive iceberg whose depth is completely unknown to us. But this depth beneath the surface is what's responsible for the majority of the process. This vast unknown is what's governing most of everything we do in our art. Think about the amount of activity happening in different parts of our mind and body that lead to the creation of art. Muscle memory and fine motor skills, the incorporation of knowledge that you've forgotten having learned, past life experiences, preferences you aren't aware of, and unknown but certainly present and active links between what we've seen and marks made on the canvas. All of these things clearly have a greater contribution to the whole than our conscious thought has. Which begs the question, are we even the ones making? Maybe it's more so the case that the art is making us through its presence. If we allow it, it forms our identity, and our connection with our deepest self is molded by it. I like to think of this 5% conscious brain and 95% everything else dynamic as quite similar to the one between a conductor and the orchestra. The conductor works to maintain cohesion amongst the orchestra, often a very skilled orchestra comprised of many skilled musicians who could probably perform great music individually and collectively without the conductor. A conductor interprets a piece of music, practices and rehearses it with the orchestra, but when a piece is brought to stage and it's time to perform, with all due respect to conductors, at this point, the conductor is only a holdover from rehearsal, a figurehead. They aren't needed much anymore aside from providing occasional cues and keeping tempo. And if we were to look at the bigger picture, as far as this performance is concerned, all that really matters in this triad is the music and the orchestra. And if I may continue this analogy a bit further, there are most certainly good conductors and bad conductors. Good conductors aim to connect with the music and their instrument, which is the orchestra. They seek to imbue the music with more tangibility and pull out the substance of what makes the music important to them. If I were to get really extreme with how I view the greatest of conductors, I'd say the greatest conductor is sort of like an interpreter of tongues or a conduit through which the otherwise wordless and indescribable art is shown to be beautiful or meaningful to the world. But most importantly, they step aside. They know that the music is the most important thing at play. But on the other hand, a bad conductor may have more selfish incentives. They may be overly controlling or self-aggrandizing. They may be more interested in fueling their ego rather than being in service of the music. And they may have very rigid stances on the nature of art, what is and isn't art, and why anything that doesn't align with their preconceptions is invalid. A conductor's role is important, but they cannot perform their duties without the orchestra. What is the conductor without the orchestra other than an interpreter of the artistry before them? What is a pianist without a piano? What is an artist without their tool other than a person who thinks and thinks but does not create? If the music is the art, then the orchestra is your body. It's your facility with your instrument. Or in other words, the internal, hidden part of you that doesn't do any thinking, but manifests the art into reality. And the conductor is your conscious mind, the self you identify with, the self with an ego, the self that ascribes meaning, the you that attempts to explain what was created and why, and tries to claim authorship of a piece of art your body produced is merely a teensy part of the equation. And given all of what I said, I still feel like I'm only scratching the surface with this. And there are still a lot of personal viewpoints I have on this topic. If you want to know what I think my art is sentient. And I'd even go as far to say that I sometimes find my art to be borderline sapient when given the sophistication of discussion to be had with it, and the profound enlightenment to be uncovered between me and art when we sit down to have these deep conversations about ourselves and each other. Art has shown to me that it can be self-aware, intelligent, capable of complex reasoning, and full of wisdom. And the artwork that arises from these discussions are representative of a whole host of qualities that define us, a manifestation of our being originating from realms beyond our perception. Why don't we learn to let go? I reckon we leave the traversal of the vast, complicated map of the art practice to the one who knows this territory the best. The greatest pilot and captain you could ask for on this journey, art itself. Acknowledge the presence of this being who sits next to you at the drawing table and dispel any notion that any of this art-making stuff is all on you. Adopting this mindset is actually freeing. It allows you to not be all in your head about it, what's happening and why, what are people going to think, why you think you're not improving, and etc. Because none of that matters. None of that matters. It only matters because we trick ourselves into thinking that all conditions and outcomes in the practice are of our own volition. All there is to know about the art process can be learned through engagement with it, through communication with it. Thoughts mulled over by the conscious mind alone seldom lead to sound conclusions about the practice, and they often tend to muddy the waters more than anything. So just let go. Stop trying to steer this ship. You might crash it if you're not careful. You're not art, and you haven't let them teach you enough about this yet. There are still many more lessons to learn. So relinquish your will and enjoy the ride. You're not in this alone. You're in great company, actually, with the wisest teacher. What a coincidence. Thanks for listening.